The leather whip cracked against the morning air as Colonel James Whitmore stood frozen in the doorway of the plantation schoolhouse. Before him sat an impossible scene that would shatter everything he believed about order, race, and his own household. His 8-year-old daughter Charlotte shared a wooden bench with Ezra, the blacksmith's son, both bent over the same primer book. At the front of the room, his wife Margaret held a slate board, teaching letters to 12 children, 6 white, 6 black, as if such a thing were natural as breathing. The colonel's face drained of color, then flushed crimson. For 3 years, while he conducted business in Savannah and Atlanta, Margaret had been running what amounted to a criminal enterprise under his own roof. Teaching enslaved children to read was not merely forbidden by Georgia law. It was punishable by imprisonment, hefty fines, and social exile that would destroy their family's standing forever. Margaret. His voice cut through the recitation like a blade through silk. Every head turned. The enslaved children's eyes went wide with terror, recognizing the danger they had stumbled into. Charlotte looked confused, innocent of the social catastrophe unfolding around her. But Margaret's face showed no surprise, only the weary resignation of someone whose secret had finally been exposed. The whip trembled in James's grip as he surveyed the evidence. Books scattered across tables, slates covered in careful lettering, maps pinned to walls, showing places these children would never be allowed to visit. His wife had not simply broken the law, she had challenged the very foundation of their world, turning their home into a sanctuary for the unthinkable. In that moment, 3 years of careful deception crumbled, and the real battle for these children's futures was about to begin. Margaret Whitmore had not always been a revolutionary. Born into Charleston's aristocracy, she had married James at 19, expecting a life of garden parties and charitable committees. The move to Whitmore Plantation in rural Georgia should have been a simple transition from city refinement to country gentility. Instead, it became her awakening to horrors she had never imagined. The first shock came during her initial tour of the slave quarters. She discovered Celia, barely 14, nursing a newborn while her own toddler clung to her skirts. The girl's hollow eyes and trembling hands revealed a story Margaret's sheltered upbringing had never prepared her to witness. When she learned that Celia could neither read nor write her own name, something fundamental shifted inside Margaret's carefully constructed worldview. The second revelation came months later, when she found young Ezra carving letters into tree bark with a rusty nail, desperately trying to teach himself what was forbidden. His hunger for knowledge reminded her of her own childhood curiosity, and she realized that intelligence and yearning for learning recognized no color boundaries. Margaret began with small acts of rebellion. She taught Celia to write her children's names, justifying it as practical household management. She shared discarded books with the older enslaved women, claiming they were too damaged for the main house. Each small transgression made the next one easier, until she found herself planning something far more dangerous. The schoolhouse had been built for Charlotte's education, but Margaret saw its potential for something greater. While James traveled on business, she began gathering children, enslaved and free, under the pretense of supervised play. What started as alphabet games evolved into formal lessons, creating bonds that transcended the plantation's rigid social hierarchy. By the time James discovered her secret, Margaret had already crossed a line from which there could be no return. The confrontation in the schoolhouse marked the beginning of a war fought in whispered conversations and cold silences. James immediately forbade any further lessons, posting armed overseers near the building and threatening severe punishment for any enslaved person found with reading materials. But Margaret's 3 years of careful work had already planted seeds that proved impossible to uproot. The enslaved children had tasted knowledge, and hunger for learning burned in their eyes despite the danger. Ezra continued practicing letters in the dirt, quickly erasing them when footsteps approached. Sarah, the cook's daughter, recited multiplication tables while churning butter. They had learned to hide their education, but they could not unlearn what Margaret had taught them. James's fury extended beyond the immediate scandal. He discovered that Margaret had been corresponding with abolitionists in the North, sharing stories and seeking advice about gradual emancipation. Her letters, hidden in a false bottom of her jewelry box, revealed a woman he no longer recognized, someone who questioned everything their society held sacred. The social consequences came swift and merciless. When word spread to neighboring plantations, the Whitmores found themselves isolated from their former social circle. Dinner invitations ceased, business partnerships dissolved, and former friends crossed streets to avoid acknowledging them. The local minister delivered sermons about the divine order of society, clearly aimed at Margaret's transgression. But the cruelest punishment was watching the enslaved families torn apart. James sold 3 of the older students to distant plantations, claiming they had become troublesome and uppity. The remaining children lived in constant fear, their brief taste of equality replaced by heightened surveillance and suspicion. Margaret watched her world crumble, knowing that her choices had endangered everyone she had tried to protect. Yet even as consequences mounted, she could not bring herself to regret what she had done. Underground networks had always existed on southern plantations, but Margaret's schoolhouse had created something unprecedented, a group of enslaved children who could read, write, and think critically about their circumstances. Despite James's crackdown, these skills became tools of quiet rebellion that spread through the quarters like wildfire. Ezra emerged as an unexpected leader among the children. At 12, he possessed both the intelligence Margaret had nurtured and the street wisdom necessary for survival. He organized clandestine study sessions in the woods, using charcoal on tree bark when paper was unavailable. The children developed elaborate signals to warn of approaching overseers, turning their education into an act of coordinated resistance. Margaret found ways to support them despite her husband's surveillance. She left books in predetermined locations, hidden inside hollow logs or buried beneath loose floorboards. When James burned her teaching materials, she began memorizing entire passages to recite during brief encounters with the children. Her morning walks through the quarters became opportunities to share fragments of knowledge through seemingly innocent conversations. The transformation extended beyond academics. The enslaved children who had experienced equality in Margaret's classroom began questioning other aspects of plantation hierarchy. They walked with straighter backs, looked overseers in the eye, and spoke with confidence that made their masters uncomfortable. This subtle defiance spread to their parents, creating an atmosphere of tension that James could feel but not quite identify. Charlotte, now 9, became an unwitting bridge between the two worlds. She continued friendships with the enslaved children despite her father's disapproval, sharing information and carrying messages. Her innocent questions about why her former classmates could no longer visit forced uncomfortable conversations about justice and social order. The plantation's careful balance of power had been permanently disrupted, and everyone sensed that larger changes were inevitable. Margaret's greatest torment came not from social ostracism or her husband's anger, but from watching the enslaved children she had come to love face an uncertain future. She had given them knowledge that made their bondage more painful, while providing no clear path to freedom. The weight of this responsibility consumed her thoughts and haunted her dreams. Celia's situation exemplified the cruel paradox Margaret had created. Now 17 and literate, Celia understood exactly what her enslavement meant in ways that ignorance had previously shielded her from. She could read newspaper accounts of the growing abolition movement, making her acutely aware of the freedom that existed just beyond her reach. Margaret had intended to empower her, but instead had made her suffering more acute. The moral complexity deepened when Margaret discovered she was pregnant with her second child. The pregnancy forced her to confront uncomfortable questions about bringing another white child into a world built on the suffering of the black children she had learned to love as her own. How could she celebrate her baby's future while knowing that Ezra and Sarah faced lives of permanent bondage? James's business troubles added another layer of crisis. The social boycott had damaged his cotton sales, and mounting debts threatened the plantation's survival. He began making plans to sell more enslaved families, viewing them as liquid assets to solve his financial problems. Margaret realized that her actions had not only failed to help the children, they had actually made their situations more precarious. Desperate to find solutions, Margaret began corresponding with Underground Railroad conductors, exploring possibilities for helping some of the children escape to freedom. But such plans required resources she didn't have, and posed risks that could destroy what remained of her family. Every option seemed to lead to greater danger for the people she was trying to protect. The woman who had started with simple compassion now faced impossible choices with no clear moral path forward. The discovery of Margaret's Underground Railroad correspondence pushed James beyond anger into something approaching madness. He found the letters hidden in Charlotte's dollhouse, where Margaret had assumed they would be safe from his searches. The revelation that his wife had been actively planning to help enslaved people escape transformed their marriage into a battlefield where no quarter would be given. James's retaliation was swift and devastating. He sold Ezra's entire family to a notorious plantation in Mississippi, separating the boy from everyone he had ever known. The sale happened so quickly that Margaret had no opportunity to intervene or even say goodbye. When she learned what had occurred, she collapsed in the garden, her cries of anguish carrying across the quarters and striking fear into every enslaved heart. The remaining children lived in terror, knowing that any of them could be next. Parents who had initially supported Margaret's teaching now begged their children to forget everything they had learned, desperate to protect them from James's wrath. The sense of community that had flourished in the schoolhouse dissolved into suspicion and fear. Charlotte, now old enough to understand the gravity of the situation, began experiencing nightmares about her missing friends. She stopped eating regularly and spent hours staring out her bedroom window toward the empty slave quarters. Her innocence had been shattered by witnessing the brutal realities of the world her family had built their wealth upon. Margaret's pregnancy progressed amid this atmosphere of crisis and loss. She found herself unable to feel joy about the coming child, knowing it would be born into a world where love could be bought and sold, where education was a crime, and where her own actions had brought suffering to those she had tried to help. The plantation had become a prison for everyone who lived there, enslaved and free alike, trapped by systems of oppression that seemed impossible to escape. Winter brought harsh realities that stripped away any remaining illusions about the sustainability of Margaret's secret rebellion. The cold weather confined everyone to smaller spaces, making clandestine meetings impossible and forcing the enslaved children to abandon their hidden study sessions. Knowledge that had once flourished in secret began to fade from disuse and fear. Margaret gave birth to a son in December, but the joy she had expected never materialized. Holding her healthy white baby, while knowing that enslaved mothers in the quarters had no guarantee their children would remain with them, felt like a mockery of maternal love. She named him Thomas, after her father, but found herself unable to bond with the infant who represented everything wrong with their world. James's financial situation continued deteriorating, forcing him to consider selling the plantation entirely. Potential buyers toured the property, evaluating both land and human property with the same calculating eyes. Margaret watched these inspections with growing horror, knowing that a sale would scatter the remaining enslaved families to unknown fates across the South. The isolation from their former social circle had taken its toll on James as well. Once a confident man who commanded respect in business and social settings, he had become suspicious and bitter. He drank heavily and spent long hours alone in his study, poring over account books and correspondence with creditors. The man Margaret had married seemed to have disappeared, replaced by someone she barely recognized. Charlotte's education had been suspended indefinitely, as James no longer trusted any teacher who might share his wife's dangerous ideas about equality. The girl spent her days caring for her baby brother and reading the same books repeatedly, her bright mind slowly dulling from lack of intellectual stimulation. As winter deepened, everyone on the plantation seemed trapped in a nightmare from which there was no awakening. Spring brought unexpected correspondence that would change everything. A letter arrived from Boston, written in careful script that Margaret immediately recognized as Ezra's handwriting. The impossible had happened. Somehow, the boy had not only survived his sail to Mississippi, but had escaped to freedom and learned to write with remarkable skill. The letter was brief but powerful, describing Ezra's journey north and his current life as a free person working in a printing shop. More importantly, he had not forgotten the lessons learned in Margaret's schoolhouse or the other children who had shared those precious moments of equality. He was working with abolitionists to document the stories of enslaved people and had begun writing about his experiences on the Whitmore plantation. Margaret read the letter dozens of times, tears streaming down her face as she realized that her efforts had not been entirely in vain. At least one child had escaped the system that had trapped them all, and he was using his education to fight for others still in bondage. The knowledge that her teaching had contributed to his freedom provided the first genuine hope she had felt in months. But the letter also brought new dangers. If James discovered that Ezra was not only free, but actively working against slavery, his rage would know no bounds. Margaret burned the letter immediately after memorizing every word, but she could not burn the hope it had rekindled in her heart. She began planning more carefully, using her correspondence with northern abolitionists to gather information about escape routes and safe houses. If she could not save all the children, perhaps she could save some of them. The risks were enormous, but the alternative, watching them grow up in bondage, had become unbearable. Charlotte, now 10, had begun asking difficult questions about why some children were free while others were not. Margaret realized that her daughter's moral education was as important as any academic subject she might teach. Margaret's plan crystallized around the summer solstice, when longer days would provide more time for travel and warm weather would make survival in the wilderness more likely. She had identified 3 children whose situations were most precarious: Sarah, whose mother had died and who faced being sold to pay debts; Marcus, a brilliant boy whose intelligence made overseers nervous; and little Anna, only 7, but already showing signs of the spirit that had made Ezra a target. The logistics were staggering. Margaret needed to coordinate with Underground Railroad conductors she had never met, arrange supplies and transportation, and create alibis that would delay discovery of the children's absence. Most challenging of all, she had to accomplish this while caring for an infant and maintaining the pretense of being a reformed plantation mistress. Her opportunity came when James announced a business trip to Charleston that would keep him away for a week. Margaret immediately sent coded messages to her contacts, using a system of flower arrangements and seemingly innocent letters about garden planning. The response came quickly. A conductor would meet them at a predetermined location, but only if they could reach it within 24 hours of departure. The night before the escape attempt, Margaret barely slept. She had sewn gold coins into the children's clothing and prepared a bag of supplies that could be quickly hidden if necessary. Charlotte had been told that her mother was planning a surprise for some of the enslaved children. a half-truth that satisfied her curiosity without revealing the full danger. As dawn approached, Margaret made her final preparations. She wrote letters to be discovered after her departure, one to James explaining her actions, another to Charlotte to be read when she was older. She knew that success would mean exile from everything she had known, while failure would likely mean imprisonment or worse. But the faces of the children she was trying to save made the choice inevitable. The escape began in darkness, with Margaret leading 3 terrified children through woods she had explored during her morning walks. Each step took them further from the plantation and closer to either freedom or catastrophe. The children moved silently, their bare feet making no sound on the forest floor, their eyes wide with fear and desperate hope. Margaret had chosen the route carefully, avoiding main roads and staying near the river that would mask their scent from tracking dogs. The weight of baby Thomas in her arms made progress slow, but she refused to leave him behind. Charlotte walked beside her, still believing they were on some kind of adventure, her innocent chatter a stark contrast to the gravity of their situation. The first crisis came at dawn, when they reached the meeting point, but found no conductor waiting. Margaret's heart sank as she realized that something had gone wrong with the carefully laid plans. They were exposed in open country with nowhere to hide, and James would soon discover their absence. The children looked to her for guidance, their trust both heartbreaking and terrifying. Then Marcus spotted movement in the distance, a wagon approaching slowly along the dirt road. Margaret's relief turned to terror when she recognized the driver as one of James's business associates, a man who would certainly report their location. She quickly herded the children into a grove of trees, pressing her hand over baby Thomas's mouth to muffle his cries. The wagon passed without stopping, but Margaret knew their time was running out. James would organize search parties, and every minute of delay made capture more likely. She made the agonizing decision to continue toward the next checkpoint, even though it meant traveling in daylight, with no guarantee of finding help. The children followed without complaint, understanding that their lives depended on reaching safety before their absence was discovered. The sound of hoofbeats echoing through the morning air confirmed Margaret's worst fears. James had discovered their absence sooner than expected and was leading a search party with tracking dogs and armed overseers. The children's faces went pale with terror as they heard the baying of hounds growing closer, knowing that capture would mean punishments beyond imagination. Margaret pushed them harder, abandoning caution for speed as they crashed through underbrush toward the river. Charlotte began to understand that this was no adventure, her mother's desperation finally penetrating her childish assumptions. Baby Thomas wailed continuously now, his cries a beacon that would lead their pursuers directly to them. The river appeared ahead, but Margaret's heart sank when she saw no boat waiting at the designated crossing point. The conductor had either been captured or had fled when he learned of the search party. They were trapped between the water and their pursuers, with no means of escape and nowhere to hide. Sarah grabbed Margaret's arm, her young face showing remarkable composure despite the circumstances. "Miss Margaret," she whispered, "you take your babies and go back. Tell them we ran off on our own. Maybe they won't punish you so hard." The selflessness of this child, willing to sacrifice herself to protect the woman who had tried to save her, broke something fundamental inside Margaret's heart. She realized that her actions had not only failed to free these children, but had placed them in greater danger than ever before. The hoofbeats grew louder, and James's voice could be heard shouting orders to spread out and surround the area. Margaret faced the most terrible decision of her life: surrender and hope for mercy, or fight to the end, knowing that resistance would make their punishment more severe. In that moment, she understood that some battles could not be won, only fought with dignity. The confrontation by the river lasted only minutes, but its consequences would echo through generations. James arrived with 6 armed men. his face twisted with rage and betrayal as he surveyed his wife holding an enslaved child's hand while their own baby cried in her arms. The symbolic power of that image, white and black children united in fear and hope, struck him like a physical blow. But something unexpected happened in that moment of ultimate crisis. Charlotte, finally understanding the full scope of what her mother had been trying to accomplish, stepped forward and placed herself between the search party and the enslaved children. Her small voice carried clearly across the water as she declared, "These are my friends, Papa. Mama was trying to help them be free." The innocence and moral clarity of his own daughter's words shattered James's certainty about the righteousness of his cause. For the first time, he saw the situation through the eyes of a child who had experienced true equality and found it natural and good. The cognitive dissonance between his daughter's pure heart and his own hardened beliefs created a crack in his worldview that would never fully heal. Margaret expected violence, imprisonment, or exile. Instead, she watched her husband's shoulders slump as the fight went out of him. The man who had built his identity on controlling others found himself unable to punish his own family for choosing love over law. He ordered the search party to return to the plantation, claiming the children had been found and returned voluntarily. The ride back passed in silence, but Margaret noticed that James made no move to separate her from the enslaved children or to bind them for punishment. Something fundamental had shifted in the balance of power between them, though neither could yet articulate what it meant. That evening, as the plantation settled into an uneasy quiet, Margaret found a new letter hidden in her garden. Another message from Ezra, somehow delivered despite the chaos. This time, his words carried news that would change everything. The war everyone had been whispering about was finally beginning, and freedom was coming whether the South was ready or not. The children Margaret had tried to save would soon be liberated by forces far greater than her individual courage. But the seeds of compassion she had planted would continue growing long after the last chains were broken. In the end, her greatest victory was not in the escape that failed, but in the hearts and minds she had opened to the possibility of a different world. The story ended not with dramatic resolution, but with the quiet understanding that some revolutions begin in schoolhouses, spread through whispered lessons, and triumph not through force, but through the simple recognition of shared humanity.